As the glaciers melt and the saltwater seas rise, there's no more avoiding the difference that the human difference has made on the more than human world, and then on itself.
The biggest boom means some mighty big holes, and it doesn't come much bigger than this. Mount Whaleback, 2 kilometres across, 6 kilometres long. It's the biggest single iron ore pit in the world. And at current prices, it's making BHP Billiton more than $5 million.
But what is this human difference? Or who is this human difference? From what point of view, from what specific worlds does this human difference come? And what specific humans are making the patterns causing the saltwater seas to rise and the glaciers melt? For a long time, I've been interested in the human difference that emerged during the colonial period and submerged or attempted to submerge other humans,
a mine in the east of
and
Congo.
their more than human
These men work
worlds and
so that we can
relations.
make telephone calls. They're mining coltan, which is indispensable for the production of mobile phones.
What is the other of this human difference? I want to reflect on the possibility of this other human difference that has emerged from the waters that have defined the various worlds that have defined me. Freshwater and saltwater, liquid and frozen water, and water still in its hot and steamy state. The first act would take us to Shreveport, Louisiana, in the southern part of the United States, and the icy glaciers that define the upper reaches of Corisolo, my ancestral village in the Alps of Trentino. The second act will take me to my Cottabing colleagues, whose lands lie along the saltwater seas of the northwest territories of what we now call Australia. I grew up in the sweltering heat of northwestern Louisiana. In the summers, the air was so humid, it mocked the distinction between liquid and gas. I would feel a deep identification with the phrase fish out of water, unable to breathe the air that threatened to become water. My siblings and I would pray for the walls of rain that would concentrate themselves and then rage across the landscape, dropping the temperature 20 degrees in their wake, but then leaving behind more steam as the blistering concrete streets boiled away their remainders. During the long, stifling summers, we would try to get relief in a local lake. It wasn't a huge body of water, maybe about 400 meters long and 50 meters across. But it was large enough and deep enough to hold its cold and create multiple micro environments for scuttling crawfish, for patrolling brim and bass, for threatening poisonous snakes, for tadpoles and what they would become, toads and frogs. We never saw any alligators, or I didn't, in that lake. But it was deep and opaque enough for me to have ominous nightmares of enormous prehistoric paddlefish indigenous to the area, which would emerge from its bottoms with its wide, gaping mouth. I felt the spectral paddlefish was in excess of any definition I could afford. But alongside my inability to define the lake and the more than human worlds that defined its pattern, were other designs in those southern woods and worlds. Those designs were created by a different form of human difference, a form of radical liberal human indifference that divided my world, doors for some and doors for others, with those doors leading to radically different futures based on the way in which the human had been defined in the long arm of colonial racism.
Let me put it another way, all right? In the first place, it is not a Southern problem. It's a national problem. What is happening in New Orleans today began to happen over 100 years ago when, in effect, the North, which was the government, having freed tens of thousands of illiterate black men, then made no provision for them, none whatever. None whatever. They were dumped on the body politic, and no one was responsible for them. And they were, of course, immediately political and industrial footballs for everybody.
Now, no matter how hot the summers were, I preferred them to the northern winters we left behind. I was born in Buffalo, New York in the frigid February. We'd often go back there to visit our family and especially our grandparents and great aunts and uncles. Even in August, it was too cold in Buffalo for me to consider cannonballing into my cousin's pool. My father's parents, uncles, and aunts didn't think it was cold enough. They'd tell increasingly outlandish stories of life on the glaciers just above our ancestral village in Trentino. They made it seem like the best humans were defined by the capacity to withstand ice, icy water, icy winds, ice-capped Alps. They clearly thought their mountains, their cascades, their rivers and valleys made them special, and that their village and its way of life was better than all others. Begging the question, of course, why were we in America? In the US, where we actually were, my father would pull out our Bel Air blue station wagon onto the side of mountain bridges when we did our annual camping trips to the US West. He'd pull my brothers out of the car and scramble down the mountainside into the streams below. They would all come back, my brothers slightly blue and shaking. What is he doing to you? He's making us plunge into the icy waters because he wants us to be mountain men. He thinks withstanding ice water makes you strong. Little surprised that when I arrived in Darwin, Australia in the sweltering September 1984, I found myself environmentally at home. Here, in addition to the water-saturated air and inland swamps, were saltwater seas and a different pattern of fish, of reptiles, of amphibians, birds, snakes, and other animals that roamed through these regions. There were no mountains anywhere, and definitely no ice except what came out of one kind of machine and was conserved in another. Storms also came here, bigger and lasting much longer than I had known in Shreveport. Monsoons would pour for months on end until everything was in a state of mold and rot. Clothes, skins, buildings didn't matter. Those with money could huddle inside with other machines that would cool their air. For those too poor to have these machines, we just sweltered and rotted. But I didn't merely encounter a new kind of water. As I came to know the indigenous men and women who lived at Belleune across the Darwin Harbor, I slowly came to refashion the glacial identity that I had carried around with me in relation to the southern swamp. My Belleune friends map human differences onto the types of water that define lands. For them, there are saltwater people, freshwater people, and desert people, each with their own distinct sweat, ceremonial ways, ecological practices, forms of marriage and alliance. Most indigenous Belune folks are saltwater people, as are the members of the Katabing Film Collective.
Like we got Suntu group, we got Kio, we are run, they got their own place and own story, like we our own country. We got Trevor map, they got their own country, they got Bujut, own language, own story. We got Bujut map, they got their own story. Emiangal got their own story, like Mabluk. Mendiangal got their own story, like Kugun map. But we still one map.
And there's a thing with that.
Even though we all got different language and different land, but we all connected to
The
one.
story where the dulk
We're
with
not
fire
different,
and
we
the-
all one mob. And that makes us
Yeah.
Caribbean.
Saltwater people, like my Povinelli family, are quite proud of their country. They could be said to be joyfully arrogant, like my grandparents and great aunts and uncles, about the superiority of their lands and waters. They have totems in the saltwater seas, in the inland swamps. They have totems that define the very geography of the land. It was not long before we began to exchange pride for pride in a game of one-upsmanship. Why is saltwater better than freshwater? Because saltwater people have both. Why are ice mountains better than freshwater swamps? You can see what's coming up on one side and slide down the other. One revels in the pleasures of the patterns that compose one's lands and thus one's bodies, one's senses, one's orientations and obligations. On the other hand, one notices that other patterns exist in the world and that one's own patterns come to be held in place by their extended entanglement in their larger and larger neighborhoods. One can even judge one's own pattern of existence as superior and better than all others. But that pride in my mountain, my glacial river, their seas, their inland swamps, doesn't necessarily result in an antagonism with other patterns of existence. On the one hand, this is because, as Linda Yerwin, as Rex Edmonds, as Cecilia Lewis, and others in Katabing have said, while one has one's roan or own lands, own language, own traditions and stories, these stories come from a set of events that interconnected the lands. These sets of events include forms of marriage. They include the travel of ancestral totems that remain present in the land. And it includes the necessary travel of plants and animals and the patterns they need, which are larger than and encompass and help define both one's own land in relation to others. Thus, if one seems to start with the pride of one's own pattern of existence, in fact, presupposed in that is an understanding of the necessity to hold in place other people's patterns of existence and the more than human pattern of existence. Thus, you look across and you might even laugh and say, oh, I can't believe they do it that way. But that's their way of doing it. If you disrupt their way, then the understanding is that disruption here will then have the effect on your own pattern of existence. Even as these boastful riddles expressed a certain kind of joy in forms of human difference defined by the more than human world and the patterns it provided people, the difference between humans and their environments was not understood in the language of friend and enemy, nor in a language of difference that has come to define late liberalism. The human difference that the Karabing express is a form of difference that makes room for other difference.
Country die out too. If people Macron Beria, you know, and shut himself up, like in that movie we made. Which movie?
Some people come here. And
Mermaid one, and mermaid. Toronto. The mermaid, what that thing? Wonderland movie. Erin in Wonderland, you remember that story? Yeah. They got that country die out. When people don't go back there and mind if that country go away or go back and look, country shut themselves up.
Yep.
And they hide everything. And they need to go back there, they hide him everything. No? You can find him crab maybe. You can find him goose. You can find bullocky like that. If our ancestors will get angry with us, we're not doing the right thing.
Karabing acknowledged that there are many parts of existence, the more than human world, who are creating their own patterns of existence in relation to Karabing, but are not defining those patterns of existence for Karabing or necessarily even for the human world. For humans to stay in the pattern they are, they must allow others, human and otherwise, to make worlds for their own reason, toward their own ends, in their own designs.
Sugar bait.
What's sugar bait?
Honey in this thing we can eat it, but
We eat it.
yeah, sugar bait got the honey and the yellow stuff.
How do you get it?
We get him stick out of one and we eat him when I land pet now eat him. You give me sugar bait. You gotta give me sugar bait.
No.
Give me sugar bait. What's wrong? You gotta give me sugar bait.
Finish all the white men with poison and gotta shut myself up now.
And I'm a question one. Still right that sugar bait. Oh, come on, give me now.
When Paragon come in, they sort of took over them. Like Paragon came in and said, "Look, listen to me. I'm your boss now. You do this and that for me.
Yeah.
Don't worry about what your elders say and tell you. I'm your boss. They are taking control of me." Like that. They said they've been separating with everybody from land and country.
White men been bringing the story, probably just force people to say, come and this for that people land and that, and certain people get.
They're the one making the
You got
Today,
TO
take
for
control
that
of Indigenous
for
lands.
that
Can I help you?
area and TO. Somebody even locked that bloody gate here.
Yes, you have to have the paperwork filled out. You have to have the apologist go over your claim.
Everyone's a TO, little bit of land. Everyone TO
Look,
TO for that
it's the
little bit
law.
of land. TO of that little bit.
Country.
Then you get big
How am I supposed to know? it's your
argument, big
country?
fight, spear fight. Everybody killing each
I
other.
can't hear you. I can't hear you.
We all one. We don't say we're all different. We all one mob.
The form of human difference that we can no longer ignore as the glaciers melt and the saltwater seas rise. Is an understanding of the human difference within a hierarchy of being and a political language of friend and enemy, of difference as antagonism. There couldn't be a stronger contrast to the logics of late liberal human difference, in which all patterns of difference must conform to a singular design, a design that emerged out of the sadisms of slavery and indigenous dispossession, that seek to level the pattern of existence according to the conceit of a universal unfolding. Geist, reason, oneness, the all or the nothing, the us or the non-us. Let's give up this human difference that seeks to universalize itself, that seeks to demand of all other patterns of existence a singular destiny, a singular trajectory, a singular unfolding, a singular truth. For Carter Bing, if humans want to maintain their pattern of existence, if they want to continue to exist, then they have to let other forms of existence, other human forms of existence, the more than human world, to shape its own design, to have the space to move independent of what humans might want and demand of them. Decades after I arrived at Bellevuin, we had to admit that what was distinguishing us and thus holding us together was slowly threatening not to be the case anymore. The monsoons were becoming smaller and without endurance. The younger would ask the older what it was like when it rained for months on end, whether we had ever seen the creeks go this dry, the swamps parched at their source, the fish, amphibians, reptiles, animals, and birds no longer able to hold their pattern, and thus us unable to hold our rapport with that pattern. Fires got larger, got hotter, got longer. The air conditioning machines had to run faster and harder and longer to keep cooler what they were now making hotter and hotter. But they were cheaper now too, so the damage could pile up quicker and we could have some. As the great pounding of extractive capitalism compresses the earth and concretes over it, leaving nowhere for the rains to be absorbed, but only more steam to rise, new riddles and jokes have emerged amongst Carter Bing. New riddles started to emerge. Why is salt water better than fresh water? Because soon there's not going to be any fresh water at all. Why is icy mountain better than freshwater swamp? Because mountains are going to be the new beach. I'm not saltwater or freshwater. I'm concrete city. Why were desert people right all along? Do you really need me to answer that?